Hi, my name is Bryn Gruber, and I am excited to share with you my capstone project that I titled Stigma, an Omnipresent Barrier to Access and Treatment for People Who Inject Drugs. Stigma is a topic that has really interested me since starting my master's program. At my first practicum placement, I was working with individuals who had been recently released from federal prison and kind of having them describe their day to day experiences and how stigma plays a role in that, I found to be extremely interesting. I was impressed on how powerful stigma is and how also how invisible it is um, for those who are typically not the victims of the stigma. Um, I also wanted to combine my interest with stigma with a topic that I wasn't as familiar with. Um, Utah and across the country has done a great job in raising awareness in the opioid crisis that we're experiencing. Um, However, before starting this project, I didn't know much about it. So I wanted to combine these two things so when I got out into the field, I would have some relevant knowledge to add to the community. Um, so as a background, deaths have been rising pretty consistently over the last decade. Um, Fortunately, we've seen a slight decrease in heroin related deaths from 2017 to 2018. However, even at that lower number at 2018, the heroin related deaths are still 7 times the amount that we experienced back in 1999. So even though we have made some improvements, this is still a problem that needs to be addressed. And wanting to discover whether stigma played a role in people getting that sort of treatment was important to me to find out. So I reviewed 25 different studies all around the topic of stigma in people who inject drugs. And I want to kind of go over the findings that I found and talk about the 5 main strategies that people who inject drugs use to minimize stigma that later become problematic for them. So the first thing that I found with the papers that I chose for this review, I picked from that some from the United States and also some from abroad. And what I found pretty consistently that all substances carry some stigma. However, people who inject drugs seem to suffer the most from stigma universally. Um, Now that stigma might look different in different have different cultural expressions, but it's consistent that people who inject drugs often are stigmatized more than, say, cigarette, tobacco use or alcohol use. Um, and this stigma is not only from healthcare workers or mental health professionals, but people who inject drugs also internalize a lot of the stigma, which is kind of it's just a downward spiral with that. So the main 5 strategies used to mitigate stigma that I found that pretty consistent through all the papers is first is changing one's appearance. So people who inject drugs will often try to present themselves in a manner where they don't look like they are using drugs. So they'll use makeup to cover up the markings on their arm, or they'll borrow clothes from friends, or they'll even have friends where buying needles and such is can be done in a pharmacy. They'll have other people go to buy it for them. Um, the second strategy that often people who inject drugs will use to minimize stigma is just kind of to avoid healthcare in general. They'll delay it as long as possible. And this obviously becomes problematic because what often happens outside of any transmittable diseases is that the soft muscle tissue becomes infected and kind of it gets drastically worse pretty quickly. So delaying healthcare is one of the main strategies that's used to avoid the stigma altogether. Now, those that do end up making it to a healthcare provider will then, as another strategy, obviously, they won't disclose their drug use at all. They'll come in for unrelated matters and try to get what they actually need indirectly. And then when also being asked about their pain and their pain levels, another strategy that people who inject drugs will use is to actually downplay their need for pain medication. If they're going to a healthcare provider for some other um, ailment, they'll say, "Oh, I'm not in that much pain," because they're afraid that the doctors will look at them as just um, kind of as a method to get more drugs. Um, and then strategy that is used by people who inject drugs to mitigate the stigma is that they will seek alternative services. Now, this isn't always bad. Um, they, the, it's pretty common in the literature that people who inject drugs find the most success in small community-based health clinics where they can have a personal rapport with the healthcare providers. And the literature finds that if people can build rapport with healthcare workers and mental health providers, that they're often more likely to get the care that they need. But these alternative services can also look like more holistic medicine or non-evidence-based practices. Another common theme that I found in the literature is the call for more research. The body of research in this area is pretty underdeveloped, especially in effective interventions to reduce stigma. Um, However, a lot of studies that are out there currently with stigma in substance use, they pile and combine all the substance use disorders together. Um, which, when we actually look at the papers that look at injectable drugs specifically, we can see how when you combine all the drugs together, it's not very useful because there is an obviously difference between the stigma that a person might receive with alcohol than they would with injectable drugs. Um, However, there is some good news. There's a very recent study found that they were able to create an intervention that did, in fact, reduce stigma in healthcare providers. This was in Australia, and the curriculum was actually created by individuals that were culturally competent or insiders, cultural insiders with the people who inject drugs. So that is not only promising, but I think also shows the importance, which again, the majority of the research says that interventions have to be culturally specific. So stigma again is a universal thing that happens, but that stigma is often uniquely expressed depending on the culture itself. Um, in conclusion, the research shows that those who inject drugs universally experience greater amounts of stigma than those who use other sorts of substances, which puts this population at greater health and mortality risks. This research is also pretty consistent on the strategies that people who inject drugs use to minimize stigma that often become problematic for the individual. The research also is clear on how young and underdeveloped this specific research with stigma and people who inject drugs is, and how there needs to be more research, especially in the areas of how stigma affects people once they actually are in treatment. Also, there needs to be more research in effective interventions to reduce stigma from healthcare and mental health providers. And the research is just starting to show that if the psychoeducational intervention is culturally competent, that it is able to reduce stigma in healthcare providers and mental health professionals. More specifically, how this applies to social work. Social workers are not uniquely resistant to stigma, and knowing that stigma is a very likely thing to happen between a provider of a healthcare provider and a person who injects drugs, that can help us be more aware of the quality of treatment that we're able to provide, and whether or not we should refer the client or not to a service that might be better for them. And lastly, I just want to say how much I enjoyed this project and how much I learned from this, and how grateful I am for UVU and the MSW program and how it's supported me over the last few years to get me to the point where I am. So thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the research.